Hi, I'm Anthony Flaccavento. I'm a farmer and a small business owner, and in 2012 I was the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Congress here in the 9th District of Virginia. Now, when I ran, the positions that I focused on sound a good bit like what Bernie Sanders talks about in his campaign, and has been for many years. First of all, I ran on the fallacy of trickle-down economics, how prosperity and jobs were not trickling down to ordinary people, but in fact it was being sucked up from communities, from working people, from small businesses to a tiny group at the top. I talked about an alternative, what I call the bottom-up economy, and how that was emerging here in the 9th District and all over the country, a better economy for people and the environment. I talked about the need to close the loopholes and stop these perverse incentives that encourage big corporations to outsource jobs overseas or to park their profits in other countries where they never have to pay taxes. And I spoke a lot about the need for serious campaign finance reform and overturning Citizens United. I talked about all those things in a very conservative part of southwestern Virginia, and yet I found that young people, ordinary citizens, and especially working folks really gravitated to that message. They really supported it. And I guess that's why I find it especially frustrating now when I hear pundits in the mainstream media, including National Public Radio, refer to Bernie Sanders as if he's the extreme on the left, just the same as Donald Trump in the extreme on the right. Bernie Sanders' positions are not extreme. In fact, the vast majority of Americans support his core ideas. We know this from polls that have been taken several times, not just of Democrats or liberals, but of the full spectrum of eligible voters. Breaking up the big banks, 58% of people support Bernie on that. Increasing taxes on the very rich and on unearned income, 60 to 67% of voters support that. Raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, 63% of voters. Making college debt-free, 62% support that. And bringing about serious campaign finance reform so we get money out of politics, 79% of Americans support that. Even single-payer healthcare, which has been so attacked from all sides in the media, more than half of all Americans support it. So if Bernie Sanders' positions are extreme, it must mean that the majority of Americans are similarly extreme. Now, you'll also hear the pundits talk about it's not just that, but they'll say Bernie's positions, oh, they all sound good, but you know what? They're unrealistic. They're pie-in-the-sky utopian ideas that just can't work. But the truth is that most of his key ideas are in fact tried and true. They've been tested. We know, for instance, that high taxes on the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations actually are good for the economy. Between the end of World War II and the late 1960s, the top marginal tax rate on the richest Americans was between 70 and 90%, more than double our current rate, and well beyond what Bernie is talking about. And yet during that same period of time, we had the most sustained economic growth, and more importantly, that economic growth accrued to working people and the middle class. They were the primary beneficiaries. We know that the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated banking functions from financial speculations, in fact worked quite well to keep the big banks from using the deposits of ordinary Americans and taxpayers to back up their crazy financial gains. We know that college and university education, until just about a generation ago, was pretty close to debt-free for most Americans, and yet we got high-quality educations. And we know that even single-payer healthcare, though no country has a perfect healthcare system, has worked very well in Canada and many European countries, providing coverage to everybody at substantially lower costs. And even our own Medicare, flaws though it may have, has in fact provided essentially universal healthcare to elderly people in our country at lower cost, much lower cost than private insurance. Bernie's ideas are not extreme according to American voters, and Bernie's positions are not utopian because they've been tried and true. So there's really only one other argument against voting for Bernie Sanders in the primaries, and that is that he's not electable in a general election. Now, of course, we don't know what will happen between now and November 2016, but we do know that poll after poll show that Bernie does better than Hillary in a general election against all the leading Republican contenders. We also know that Bernie has been consistent in his positions for years and years, and that if there's one thing voters don't like, especially independent voters, it's a flip-flopper, and Bernie is no flip-flopper. And lastly, we know that it's Bernie who's turning out the crowds. It's Bernie who is exciting and galvanizing young people and people who typically don't get involved in politics, and that turning those folks out may well be exactly what it takes for the Democrats to win the presidential election in 2016. And if we get a big enough turnout, we may not only win the White House, but we might just get some progressive-minded people into Congress and the Senate. So when you hear that Bernie's too extreme, it's a lot of bunk. When you hear that he's not electable and his ideas can't work, I encourage you to consider what Michelle Alexander, the brilliant author of The New Jim Crow, said. She said that when politicians start telling us that it's not realistic to support a candidate who works for a movement for equality, for fair wages, for universal health care, and for an end to corporate control of our politics, when they tell you that, it's time to leave the room. I'm with Bernie, and I hope you'll consider what I've said when you go out to vote in the primaries. Thanks a lot.